Residential report writing and case studies, Chapter 3 quiz, number 2 continued. Barb is reporting an appraisal of a single family home using a URAR form. What is the best way to ensure that her report meets the requirements for an appraisal report? Meet the minimum content requirements set forth in USPAP. B, fill out the form carefully and completely. Insert a disclaimer stating that she is limited by the available space on the form. Or D, insert a competency statement. I'm going to go A, meet the minimum content requirements set forth in USPAP. Number 3, which term best describes the Fannie Mae 1004 URAR form? A, a limited appraisal. B, an unrestricted report. C, a container for a report. Or D, a restricted appraisal report. I'm going to go A. You got a 66.7. You needed 66% to pass, so you passed. Number 1, when is it inappropriate for an appraiser to provide a restricted use appraisal report? You put when there are intended users other than the client, and you answer that correctly. Number 2, Barb is reporting an appraisal of a single family home using a URAR form. What is the best way to ensure that her report meets the requirements for an appraisal report? You put meet the minimum content requirements set forth in USPAP, and you answer that correctly. Number 3, which term best describes the Fannie Mae 1004 URAR form? You said a limited appraisal. That is wrong. The correct answer is a container for a report. A form is not a report, although it can be a suitable container for a report. Chapter 3, Introduction. Continue. Standards Rule 2-2A. Standards Rule 2-2A states, A, the content of an appraisal report must be appropriate for the intended use of the appraisal, and at a minimum, state the identity of the client, or if the client requested anonymity, state that the identity is withheld at the client's request but is retained in the appraiser's work file. Comment. Because the client is an intended user, they must be identified in the report as such. However, if the client has requested anonymity, the appraiser must use care when identifying the client to avoid violations of the confidentiality section of the ethics rule. We must identify our client in the report unless they have requested anonymity. We generally know who the client is because this is the person or party who engaged us in the appraisal assignment. In the event that the client does not want to be identified in the appraisal report, you may comply with the client's request. However, if you omit the client's identity from the appraisal report, you must identify your client in your work file. It is also possible that the party who engages the appraiser might not actually be the client. Instead, this party may be acting as an agent for the client. USPAP states that an appraiser may be engaged directly by a client or through an agent. Many appraisal management companies, AMCs, consider themselves to be agents for their lender/clients. These AMCs engage the appraiser on behalf of the real client, and most AMCs do not want to be identified in the appraisal report as the client, even though they actually engage the appraiser. In these situations, an appraiser needs to clearly communicate with the party who engages him or her to determine if they are the client or if they are acting as an agent for the client. It is acceptable for an appraiser to put the lender's name on the report as the client, even though the appraiser who was engaged by an AMC, as long as the AMC is acting as an agent for the lender. Note, there may also be individual state regulations that define who the client is. End of page. Clients and intended users. Identifying other intended users may not be as simple as identifying the client. In a residential appraisal assignment, there may be a multitude of other intended users whose names we do not know. If our appraisal report will be part of a loan file that is going into the secondary mortgage market, many parties whom we cannot specifically identify may be intended users. Fortunately, we do not have to know the specific identity of all of these intended users, since we may identify them by either name or type. Using language such as intended users include the mortgagee and / or its successors or assigns, or intended users include secondary market participants covers a lot of ground and is suitable means of acknowledging many people in the secondary mortgage market pipeline who we cannot identify by name. USPAP states that the intended users are identified by the appraiser, and this identification is based upon communication with the client at the time of the assignment. Identification of intended users is made at the beginning of the assignment, and the intended users cannot be changed after the assignment is completed. Therefore, it is important that we communicate with our client early on to determine who these intended users are. Remember, the client is always an intended user. Remember, too, that Advisory Opinion 26 warns against changing the report after completion to indicate another party as the client or intended user when the requestor is not the party that engaged the appraiser and was not identified by the appraiser as an intended user at the outset of the assignment. Such an act by the appraiser would be misleading and therefore must be avoided. Clients and intended users may not be changed or added retroactively after an appraisal and report have been completed. End of page.